Officer Tiffany Rourke had spent years getting away with misconduct, but everything changed the day she slapped a well-dressed black man in court, not realizing he was a judge. In an instant, her carefully constructed career unraveled. The incident occurred in the Franklin County Courthouse in Missouri, where Rourke, known for her authoritative and no-nonsense demeanor, had been called to testify in a minor drug possession case. The courtroom was packed that day, filled with lawyers, defendants, and spectators, all waiting for proceedings to begin. The air was thick with tension, the usual murmurs of conversation subdued by the weight of legal formalities. Rourke, dressed in her crisp uniform, strode in with the confidence of someone who had never been held accountable for her actions. Over the years, complaints had been filed against her: excessive force, racial profiling, even allegations of evidence tampering. But each time, she had slipped through the cracks, protected by a system that often turned a blind eye to misconduct within its ranks. As she took her place near the witness stand, her eyes scanned the room with disdain. She had little patience for what she considered the slow, bureaucratic machinery of the court. The defendant, a young black man in his early 20s, sat with his public defender, looking nervous but resigned. Rourke had arrested him months prior, and in her mind the case was open and shut. She had no intention of being questioned or challenged. Then it happened. Instead of taking the stand, Rourke suddenly stormed across the courtroom, her face twisted in anger. Later, witnesses would say they weren't entirely sure what set her off. Perhaps a muttered comment from the defense table. Perhaps just her own simmering frustration. Whatever the reason, she moved with startling speed. Before anyone could react, she raised her hand and struck Judge Antoine Kelly across the face. The sound of the slap echoed through the room like a gunshot. Gasps filled the air. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Judge Kelly, a distinguished man in his 50s with a reputation for fairness and composure, barely flinched. He simply adjusted his tie, his dark eyes locking onto Rourke's with an intensity that made her take an involuntary step back. "I am Judge Antoine Kelly," he said, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge. "And you are in contempt of court." The silence that followed was deafening. Rourke's face drained of color as the realization of what she had just done crashed over her. The bailiffs, who had been momentarily stunned into inaction, suddenly sprang forward, seizing her by the arms. She struggled briefly, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, but no words came out. The fallout was immediate. News of the incident spread like wildfire. Within hours, video footage of the slap had gone viral, sparking outrage across social media and news outlets. The Franklin County Sheriff's Department, which had previously ignored complaints about Rourke, was forced to act. She was suspended without pay, and an internal investigation was launched, one that would soon uncover years of misconduct that had been swept under the rug. For Judge Kelly, the incident was both shocking and deeply personal. In interviews afterward, he spoke about the broader implications of what had happened. This wasn't just about one officer losing control, he said. It was about the systemic lack of accountability that allows behavior like this to continue unchecked. He called for a full review of police conduct in the county, a demand that was quickly taken up by civil rights organizations and local lawmakers. As for Rourke, her life quickly spiraled. The shield of impunity she had relied on for so long was gone. The drug case she had been testifying in was dismissed. The defendant released after his lawyer argued that Rourke's behavior demonstrated a pattern of bias and unprofessionalism. Other cases she had been involved in were reopened, with defense attorneys scrambling to challenge her credibility as a witness. But the most damning blow came when former colleagues, emboldened by the public outcry, began coming forward with their own stories. One officer recounted how Rourke had bragged about planting evidence on suspects she knew were guilty. Another described an incident where she had used a racial slur during an arrest. The department, facing mounting pressure, had no choice but to terminate her employment. Criminal charges followed. Rourke was indicted for assault, contempt of court, and obstruction of justice. As she stood before a different judge, one who had no personal connection to the case, her once defiant demeanor was gone. She looked smaller, diminished, a far cry from the officer who had once ruled the streets with unchecked authority. The trial was swift. The evidence against her was overwhelming, and the jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a guilty verdict. At her sentencing, Judge Kelly, though not presiding, submitted a victim impact statement. He spoke not of anger or vengeance, but of the need for accountability. The law must apply equally to everyone, he wrote. No one is above it, and no one should be beneath its protection. Rourke was sentenced to 3 years in prison. As she was led away in handcuffs, the irony was not lost on anyone in the courtroom. The officer who had once arrested others for breaking the law was now a convicted criminal herself. In the months that followed, the Franklin County Courthouse became a symbol of change. Judge Kelly's call for reform was heeded, with new policies implemented to increase transparency and oversight within the local police force. Community trust, long eroded by incidents of misconduct, began to slowly rebuild. And as for Tiffany Rourke, her name became a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when power goes unchecked and when justice finally catches up. Asterisk, the fallout was immediate. Asterisk, the video of the assault went viral within hours, igniting a firestorm of outrage that spread far beyond Franklin County. Cell phone footage, captured by a stunned spectator, showed a moment in horrifying clarity. Rourke's furious advance, the sharp crack of her palm against Judge Kelly's face, the collective gasp of the courtroom. By evening, the clip had been shared millions of times, accompanied by hashtags like hashtag Justice for Judge Kelly and hashtag Fire Tiffany Rourke. News outlets picked it up, running it on loop with bold cheerings. Asterisk, officer assaults judge in open court, years of misconduct exposed. Asterisk, for the first time, Rourke's carefully constructed facade of professionalism crumbled under public scrutiny. Anonymous accounts from fellow officers, past defendants, and even courthouse staff flooded social media, sharing stories of her unchecked aggression and racial bias. A former patrol partner came forward, revealing how Rourke had once bragged about teaching a lesson to a black teenager during an arrest, leaving him with bruised ribs and a broken wrist. Another witness, a convenience store clerk, recounted how she had threatened to arrest him for obstruction when he hesitated to hand over surveillance footage without a warrant. Past complaints resurfaced. Documents that had been buried in bureaucratic limbo suddenly saw the light of day. A 2017 internal report, obtained by a local journalist, detailed an allegation that Rourke had planted drugs on a suspect during a traffic stop. The case had been quietly dismissed, and the complaint marked unfounded after the arresting officer, Rourke herself, claimed the suspect had dropped the baggie when exiting the vehicle. No body cam footage existed to verify either story. Rourke had forgotten to activate hers. Then came the testimonies from her own colleagues. A rookie officer, speaking on condition of anonymity, described how Rourke had cornered her in the precinct locker room after she questioned the legality of a search. Asterisk, she got in my face and said, "You snitch on me, and I'll make sure you're stuck writing parking tickets until you quit." Asterisk, another, a veteran sergeant, admitted he had reported Rourke's behavior years earlier, only to be told by his captain to let it go because she was good at her job. Internal Affairs, now under new leadership, launched a full-scale investigation, combing through every arrest report, every use of force incident, every complaint that had ever been filed against her. The newly appointed director, a former federal prosecutor, made it clear there would be no cover-ups this time. If there's evidence of criminal conduct, she will face charges, he stated at a press conference, flanked by community leaders. No one is above the law. The department distanced itself from her with startling speed. The sheriff, who had once praised Rourke as a dedicated public servant, now called her actions inexcusable and announced an emergency review of all pending cases where she had been involved. Prosecutors scrambled to reassess convictions tied to her testimony, knowing defense attorneys would seize on her credibility being destroyed. One high-profile drug case collapsed within days when the defendant's lawyer produced records showing Rourke had lied about witnessing the suspect discard evidence. The police union withdrew support, a rare and damning move. Rourke had expected their lawyers to rally behind her. After all, they defended officers in far worse scandals. But the union president, facing pressure from rank-and-file members who fear being tarred by association, issued a terse statement. Asterisk, the actions of this individual do not reflect the values of our organization. We will not be providing legal representation in this matter. Asterisk. Her allies disappeared. The fellow officers who had once laughed at her crude jokes, who had turned a blind eye to her misconduct, now avoided her calls. Some unfriended her on social media. Others claimed they had never been close to her. Even her longtime partner, who had ridden with her for years, gave a statement to Internal Affairs detailing multiple instances where Rourke had escalated situations unnecessarily. Then came the final blow. Her daughter cut off contact. A college sophomore, Emma Rourke had spent years defending her mother against whispers of racism, insisting she was just tough on crime. But the video changed everything. In a tearful Instagram post, Emma wrote, asterisk, I can't do this anymore. I believed you when you said people were lying about you, but I saw what you did. That wasn't just losing your temper. That was who you really are. Asterisk, she changed her last name on all her accounts, blocking her mother's number. Rourke, once untouchable, now found herself completely alone. The same system that had protected her for years had turned on her with brutal efficiency. Reporters camped outside her home, shouting questions every time she stepped outside. Her neighbors, many of them Black and Latino families who had long suspected her of racial profiling, held a block meeting demanding she move out. One elderly woman, whose grandson Rourke had arrested years earlier for loitering, stood on her porch and told a local news crew, asterisk, God don't like ugly, and what she did was ugly, asterisk, legal consequences mounted. In addition to felony assault charges, Rourke was hit with civil rights lawsuit from Judge Kelly, who made it clear he intended to use any settlement to fund police accountability initiatives. The state attorney general announced a broader probe into Franklin County's handling of misconduct complaints, signaling that Rourke's case was just the beginning. And then came the reckoning within the department. The scandal forced a long overdue house cleaning. The captain who had ignored complaints against Rourke was demoted. Mandatory body cam policies, long resisted by the union, were implemented overnight. Implicit bias training, once dismissed as political correctness, became a requirement for all officers. By the time Rourke's trial began, she was a pariah, a symbol of everything wrong with policing in America. The jury took less than an hour to convict her, as the judge handed down her sentence. 2 years in prison, plus probation. Rourke finally seemed to grasp the magnitude of what she'd lost. But for the community she had terrorized for years, her downfall wasn't just about justice. It was about hope. Hope that the system could change. Hope that accountability was possible. And hope that no one would ever again wield a badge as a weapon without consequences. Asterisk, Judge Kelly, a respected figure known for his integrity, refused to escalate the situation publicly. Asterisk, in the days following the assault, media outlets clamored for his reaction, hoping for a fiery condemnation that would fuel the already blazing news cycle. But Judge Kelly, a man who had spent his career upholding the law with quiet authority, declined every interview request. Instead, he issued a single written statement. Asterisk, the justice system exists for a reason. Let it work. Asterisk, his restraint spoke volumes. This was not a man seeking vengeance, but one who trusted the process he had dedicated his life to serving. His refusal to grandstand only deepened the public's respect for him. Community leaders praised his composure, while editorial boards contrasted his dignity with Rourke's explosive arrogance. Even her most ardent former defenders found it impossible to spin the narrative in her favor. Not when the victim, a Black judge in a system historically stacked against people of color, refused to weaponize his pain. Instead, he let the system respond, and it did. The Franklin County Sheriff's Department, under intense scrutiny, moved with uncharacteristic speed. Within 72 hours of the incident, Rourke was formally charged with felony assault on a judicial officer, a crime that carried a mandatory prison sentence. The district attorney, sensing the political winds shifting, announced that her office would also review every conviction tied to Rourke's testimony over the past decade. If even one person was wrongfully convicted due to her misconduct, she said, we will make it right. A public hearing stripped Rourke of her badge, benefits, and reputation. The disciplinary board, typically a rubber stamp affair for police misconduct cases, became a spectacle of accountability. For 8 hours, victims of Rourke's abuses took the stand. Black motorists she had pulled over for driving while suspicious, Latino shopkeepers she had threatened with bogus code violations, Fellow officers who described her bullying and intimidation. One woman, her voice shaking, played a voicemail Rourke had left after she filed a complaint. Asterisk, you'll regret crossing me. Cops have long memories. Asterisk, the most damning testimony came from Rourke's own training officer, a grizzled 30-year veteran who admitted he had warned superiors about her hair-trigger temper during her probationary period. They told me to stop being so sensitive, he said, that she had the right instincts for the job. The board voted unanimously to revoke her law enforcement certification statewide, ensuring she could never wear a badge again. Witnesses testified to her misconduct, but the most chilling revelations came from the Internal Affairs investigation. Subpoenaed emails showed Rourke joking with colleagues about hunting season in majority-black neighborhoods. GPS data proved she had lied under oath about patrol routes in multiple cases. And in a final humiliating blow, forensic accountants discovered she had been double-dipping overtime pay for years, a felony that added fraud charges to her growing list of legal troubles. The community, galvanized by the incident, demanded systemic change. Protests outside the courthouse, initially focused on Rourke, soon broadened into a movement for police reform. Coalitions of faith leaders, civil rights organizations, and even conservative business owners united behind a clean slate initiative, mandatory body cameras, an independent review board for complaints, and a community oversight panel with subpoena power. For the first time in memory, the sheriff found himself negotiating with activists rather than dismissing them. Judge Kelly watched these developments with cautious optimism, but remained characteristically hands-off. When asked at a charity luncheon if he would support the reforms, he simply said, asterisk, the people have spoken. It's our duty to listen. Asterisk, his understated endorsement, carried more weight than any political speech. Rourke faded into obscurity, a pariah in the only world she had ever known. With her pension forfeited and her name toxic, she drifted through a series of dead-end jobs. Night security at a truck stop, then a cashier at a rundown hardware store. Former colleagues who ran into her said she had aged decades in months, her once imposing frame now hunched, her eyes darting at the sound of sirens. When a true crime podcast tracked her down for comment, she slammed the door, but not before muttering, asterisk, it wasn't supposed to go like this. Asterisk, taking a low-profile job far from law enforcement. She eventually resurfaced in another state, working under an alias at a warehouse that didn't ask questions. The other workers, mostly undocumented immigrants, had no idea who she was, just another middle-aged white woman with rough hands and a perpetual scowl. Sometimes, when news coverage of police brutality played on the breakroom TV, she would leave abruptly. No one ever asked why. Meanwhile, Judge Kelly continued his work, his quiet dignity speaking louder than any reprisal ever could. His courtroom became a model of reform, transparent, respectful, and fiercely fair. He instituted a pioneering second-chance docket for nonviolent offenders and required all law enforcement witnesses to complete implicit bias training. When a young public defender thanked him for changing the system, he corrected her. Asterisk, the system only changes when we all do our part. Asterisk, years later, when Kelly retired, the courthouse steps overflowed with people whose lives he had touched, former defendants now gainfully employed, cops who had learned accountability, community activists who had once protested outside his courtroom. As he stepped to the microphone, no one expected fireworks. They weren't disappointed. Justice, he said in that measured baritone, asterisk, isn't about grand gestures. It's about showing up day after day and doing what's right, even when no one's watching. Asterisk, the applause lasted 5 full minutes. Somewhere in another state, flipping burgers at a roadside diner, a woman with graying hair and a permanent sneer didn't look up from the grill, but her hand shook just slightly as the radio played the news clip. The system had worked. Asterisk, asterisk, the story became more than just a viral moment. It was a reckoning. Asterisk, asterisk, what began as a shocking courtroom assault transformed into something far more profound. A case study in accountability, a mirror held up to systemic rot, and a turning point for a community that had long suffered in silence. The footage of Rourke's slap didn't just capture one officer's meltdown. It exposed the fractures in an entire institution. For years, complaints against her had been dismissed as exaggerations or the cost of doing business in law enforcement. But this time there was no spin, no plausible deniability, just a judge's stinging cheek and the deafening silence of a system that could no longer look away. It proved that unchecked power eventually collapses under its own weight. Rourke had operated with impunity for so long that she'd forgotten a fundamental truth. No fortress of privilege is impregnable forever. Like so many before her, the corrupt politician, the abusive celebrity, the predatory executive, she mistook temporary immunity for permanent invincibility. The very arrogance that insulated her became her undoing. Had she shown even a shred of restraint that day in court, she might have retired with full benefits, her misconduct buried in forgotten files. Instead, her instinct to dominate, to lash out, to remind everyone who held the real power, became the thread that unraveled her entire career. The parallels echoed beyond law enforcement. In boardrooms, classrooms, and newsrooms across the country, people recognize a pattern. The way systems protect their own until the cost of protection becomes too great. Rourke's case joined the pantheon of cultural tipping points, alongside the fall of Harvey Weinstein and the conviction of Derek Chauvin, where the dam of complicity finally broke. And that true justice doesn't need spectacle to prevail. Judge Kelly's refusal to perform outrage was its own revolution. In an era of viral outrage and performative activism, his quiet insistence on due process became radical. While the internet screamed for Rourke's head, he ensured she received what she had denied so many others, a fair hearing. The lesson resonated. Real change isn't forged in the heat of momentary fury, but in the steady application of principle. This restraint had a ripple effect. The protesters outside the courthouse began carrying signs reading, "What would Judge Kelly do?" City council meetings, typically shouting matches, adopted his measured tone. Even the police union's reform proposal quoted his courtroom mantra, "Process matters." In the end, Tiffany Rourke's downfall wasn't just about a slap, though that single act crystallized everything. It was about the traffic stop, where she'd laughed while a teenager sobbed in handcuffs. The time she'd falsified a report because the suspect looked guilty. The countless moments she chose cruelty because she could, because no one stopped her. The slap was merely the first time her violence couldn't be explained away as just doing her job. It was about the years of arrogance that led to it. The way she'd strutted to the precinct untouchable, her misconduct badges of honor, how she'd mocked sensitivity training, and bragged about never turning on her body cam, the toxic ecosystem that enabled her, the sergeants who looked the other way, the prosecutors who relied on her testimony, the system that valued closed cases over justice. Her arrogance was an aberration. It was the inevitable product of a culture that equated brutality with strength, and the silence that finally broke. Not just the witnesses who came forward, but the officers who'd stayed quiet for years, the dispatcher who admitted erasing a complaint, the rookie who'd been too scared to report her. Their collective awakening, that complicity had consequences, became the story's true legacy. In the months that followed, the changes were tangible but imperfect. The police department hired its first black captain. Body cam compliance went from 40% to 98%. 3 wrongful convictions tied to Rourke were overturned. Yet old habits died hard. The union resisted deeper reforms, and some officers still muttered about backstabbing. But something fundamental had shifted. When a new recruit joked about Rourke ING as suspect during roll call, the room went silent. The lieutenant made him repeat it, then handed him a mop. "You just volunteer for latrine duty," he said. "That shit doesn't fly here anymore." As for Rourke, she became a cautionary tattooed on the department's psyche. Not the martyr she'd imagined, but a punchline. The punchline to a joke about hubris. Meanwhile, Judge Kelly's portrait joined the courthouse gallery, his calm gaze a permanent reminder. Power is fleeting. Dignity is forever.